This is one of my favorite quotes, and it's actually by a fellow named Thomas Boucherville. I forget how to say his whole French name. Of course, he's got like 3 surnames of this place, Boucherville, the Verchet. And he was a fur trader. Then he ends up, he learns a bit of Ojibwe, and then he actually fights with the Ojibwe as well. But he's been on the warpath with them. And then this is contrasted with another fellow who is a Detroit resident named Hunt, and he wrote also of the same kind of incident. So he says, "It was in June 1813 that I saw one of the wildest and most grand and beautiful Indian sights that I ever beheld. 12 or 1,500 warriors came down the river one beautiful morning, all in birch canoes with the British flag flying, singing their war songs, each painted differently all over their bodies as they were nearly in a nude state." And this is a painting that was done in 1813 by Rudolph von Steiger. And it's Mississippi Indians come down to visit the president. So it just shows how they would paint themselves in that red, blue paint. And then you contrast that, the very beautiful morning and the beautifully painted. And he says, this is the part. "The savages arrived in their bark canoes to the number of 300. According to custom, they had spent the preceding night at Amherstburg dancing the war dance. It is an extraordinary spectacle to see all these Aborigines assembled together at one time, some covered with vermilion, others with blue clay, and still others tattooed in black and white from head to foot. A European witnessing this strange spectacle for the first time would have thought, I truly believe, that he was standing at the entrance to hell, with the gates thrown open to let the damned out for an hour's recreation on earth. It was frightful, horrifying beyond expression." So it's the same scene, and actually the same location, and you see how one is horrifying and one's beautiful. And then both preceding these, actually, what they both talk about is how the numbers of canoes, the flotillas of canoes came up, landed so orderly, and all the way they described how the warriors disembarked and came up. He says nothing could have been more further from a disorganized group. These guys are basically saying they're really organized. But when you think of Indian warfare, you think everything's just willy-nilly and everybody just jumps out and starts yelling away and trying to, every man for themselves. But both of these quotes, although they're very different, mention that they all come up, 300 canoes coming up out of the river, all landing, disembarking in orderly fashion. So that's the other thing that I wanted to challenge, is this idea that we actually didn't have discipline in our ranks. We did, and we do. So again, it comes back to this belt, 1764. And then in 1813, Robert Dixon, a fur trader they called the Redhead, goes to see Prevost and the Rottenberg in Montreal, and then he's given this speech and a wampum belt, and he's told to take this wampum belt and go to all the nations and to proclaim and to try and get them on the British side. And on that particular belt, he says, that speech that he was told to read, he says, "My children, remember Sir William Johnson. He told you I never would forsake or abandon you. I have not, nor will I lose hold of the belt which has been so long among you. On the contrary, I will now make it stronger by the belt which I now present to you." So again, this idea of wampum belt, alliance, tying each other in the peace. And here again, although people will sometimes say, well, why are you showing that? Why do you talk about that 1764 belt? Because it's the foundation. And it's every time any major conflict happens, that's what's used as the base. And that's the one that they referred to as well. Not only did we, but also the British. So Governor Simcoe was one of the first to actually propose this idea of an Indian buffer state or Indian country. And it was supposed to be actually along the Ohio River and cover this whole area. That's what Governor Simcoe started introducing. And what he actually was saying was that if the Americans come up to fight us, they're going to either come through Detroit, Niagara, but the British actually felt confident along the St. Lawrence. So they wanted to bolster these areas. So they said, if we make it agreeable, the old boundary lines that would adhere to Wayne's Treaty at Grenville along the Ohio River, then actually what will happen is if the Americans want to come and attack Upper and Lower Canada, they'll have to go through the Indians first. So that was his strategic thinking was, okay, we're going to put a bunch of Indians here, and then what's going to happen is if the Americans get riled up and they want to conquer, they're going to have to go through them. So that was one of Simcoe's earlier ideas. Then Brock and Prevost writes to Earl of Bathurst, and he actually signs off on that, and he says, yes, we know that the native people want their land back, and this is what we're going to use to actually entice them, and we'll say that in the negotiations we'll take care of their interests. So, and that's what he says in that speech. And never will I leave you, but as your father, see that justice is done to you by the big knives, and that your hunting ground shall be preserved for your use. So again, the hunting grounds is our land and territory. So that's what we were fighting for, and that's what we were believing. But we ended up, of course, the British negotiators, that was the first thing that they threw. They actually did bring it up at the Treaty of Ghent, that we're here to look after the native people's interests. And then they had the war hawk on the American side as a negotiator, Henry Clay, and he had others, and they said, we're not even going to discuss that. That's right off the table. They said, well, we told the native nations that we were going to do this. Said, no, we're not going any further, and we're taking that off the table. So again, they said, okay, we'll take that off the table. So again, at the Treaty of Ghent, we were the ones thrown under the bus right off the bat. So here, they get informed of the Treaty of Ghent, and they end up finding out that all this land, again, is to revert to how it was prior to the war, the commencement of war. But during the war, they actually captured Prairie du Chien, which is in Wisconsin, and it was principally the Sauk warriors, namely led by the famous Sauk chief Black Hawk, who the Chicago Blackhawks are named after. He was the principal one that had captured that place, and they felt that they captured it and that they were going to own it again. And the same thing with Michilimackinac. When they captured it, they were holding on to it, and then the Americans actually came back up to try and retake Michilimackinac, and then a mixed force of Odawa and Menominee people repulsed them. So they felt again, we ended up owning Michilimackinac. And actually, if you read that Treaty of Ghent, you'll see that the first article, they actually say, we're going to set aside time. There's islands in the Bay of Fundy, Passamaquoddy Bay, that we're still disputing who owns which island. So we're going to set aside commissioners that are actually going to determine who owns that island. And that's actually what they could have done at this time. They actually had a mechanism in place where they had two commissioners who were going to settle different disputes of ownership. And they actually, once the Odawa heard that the Treaty of Ghent was signed, they actually said, we want to keep Michilimackinac. This is a place of importance to us, and we feel that we've won it, and we want to keep it, and we want to keep our British father on it. Tell the Odawa chiefs said to the commanding officer, tell the American negotiators that we will gladly give them land on the mainland if we get to keep Michilimackinac Island, and we get to keep our British father on Michilimackinac Island. So that's how important they wanted to keep Michilimackinac. And I believe they actually could have done that if we had stronger negotiators at the Treaty of Ghent that knew that, but we didn't, and they ended up just signing away everything. So here they brought these belts out again. This is after 1815. They had their council in 1816 at Drummond Island, and then again 1817 at Drummond Island. And each year the Sauk and the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk people and the Ojibwe and Odawa would come back to Drummond Island, and they had brought their pipes, and they said, is there any news? We're still ready to go to war. We still want to get back our land. And the British at that time just kept playing like, well, we haven't heard anything. And they kept holding them off and stalling. So in 1818, Odawa Chief Okeda brought these belts out, and he laid them right in front of the commanding officer there. And he recited our history from the time of the French, 1760, to the time of the British, and then the time of American Revolution, bringing it right up to War of 1812. And then he said that all this belt here is the one that you had promised us, that you were going to look after us, that you were going to provide us with protection against anybody else. And here, now you haven't done that. And this is an excerpt from that speech. He says, Father, my heart now fails me, I can hardly speak. those bad spirits, the Americans, take possession of our lands without consulting us. Father, our chiefs did not consent to have our lands given up to the Americans, but you did it, my father, without ever consulting us. So of course some of you know how consultation is now done, and it seems kind of fitting, that quote, or timeless. So here, this is the numbers of warriors that were from the US that were going to Drummond Island to get their presents in 1824. They were still living in the States, and this is the Winnebago chiefs. These first 3 rows are the ones that are called deserving, and they were the ones that actually either got wounded in the war, or they were widows, and that's why it says wives. And you see here, these ones were called common chiefs. They didn't get hurt, or they didn't have extraordinary claims. So you see at the end, there's this 45 chiefs come in that actually fought. And of course, a chief doesn't go to war by himself. He's not a chief if he doesn't have any young men. So you got to multiply that by at least 9 for their war party. And then here again, 1826, you see that the Winnebago didn't come out that time. They started to lose interest. It was coming too far for little gain. But here are the chiefs visiting from Drummond Island, Sault Ste. Marie, and La Cloche area. That would be Manitoulin and that. So there's 11 chiefs that distinguished themselves during the War of 1812, or had extraordinary claims, or were wounded. But the idea of what I was trying to do is, okay, who are these 11? And I've never found a list that said, these are the 11. Nor did I find a list that said, these are the 45 that were still living at that time. Of course, some of them died of their wounds after as well. And then just to compare how many were at Drummond Island, and then compare at Amherstburg, which is south of Detroit, and there's 34. And you see, when we look at the distribution of where these warriors were coming from, and you see there's 34 that distinguished themselves from Amherstburg, which is already kind of close to where the Northern Theater of War is, whereas you see 45 that have distinguished themselves up from Michilimackinac area, and they're the ones who come all the way down to Detroit, and then they go down to the Niagara front as well. So there's this other idea that I want to kind of debunk, is that it was just the Six Nations that were on the Niagara frontier at that time. We were actually there, as well as the Munsees, and even you'll see Kickapoo. You don't hear anybody talk about the Kickapoo warriors that came and fought with the British on the Niagara front. So here's Babamadabi, and I was telling you, he's got a bit of a mustache and a little bit of a beard on that figure before. And so he's got this sword, and this sword, we had it on display at the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation Museum in Chiging in 2002. And just last month in September, this actual sword, this fella is named Mochmanish. He also had the name Babamadabi. He signed treaties on the American side as Babamadabi, and then he signed the 1836 treaty in Canada as Mochmanish. And then, so he was living both, because he didn't look at it as a boundary. He said, this is all our land. This is Odawa land. We don't abide by this boundary that you've imposed. But he was wounded on the Wabash River at a battle, and his leg was taken out, and he would have died there, he says, if chance hadn't brought a horse and by his way, and he was able to mount that horse. And then he actually captured a young American that wounded him. And then by the Odawa Code of War, he should have killed him right then and there, but he didn't. He brought him back to the garrison, and for that act of compassion, he was given that sword as a mark of the distinguishment. And so there's actually a certificate that goes with that as well. But this sword was in the Kenoshmeg family. This guy's son was named Kenoshmeg, and now the Kenoshmegs live in Weequampong, and that name is still carried on. But that sword is at the Canadian War Museum. And what it ended up happening is the Kenoshmeg people that I talked to, they said their grandfather used to say, we had that sword, and then they came by and they said they just wanted to show somebody in Toronto, and they were going to bring it back, and they never brought it back. So they've been trying to get it back. But the one good thing that I do have to applaud the Canadian War Museum, they have this on exhibit right now, and it started, I think, in June. The exhibit opened in June. and it's going to end in January. But you'll see that canoe and this sword. But the good thing that the Canadian War Museum did, they actually came down in September and they brought this sword and they brought a war club. They took it right out of the exhibit and they brought it to show the people of Wikwemikong this sword, and that everyone could see it. So that was really good of them. The other thing that this fella Eric Fenberg had done, he showed that sword and he opened it up. So it's got an ivory hilt, and it's got the lion, the British lion head on there, and it's got all this elaborate work, and then it's got, this is actually all carved up. It's got engravings on it. So what this Eric Fenberg had said is, when this sword was brand new and you opened it up, it would glow blue. That's how nice, when the sunlight hit it or any light hit it, it would glow blue. That's how nice this thing was. And I thought, oh, that sounds cool. Just like if you ever watch Lord of the Rings, when the orcs are around, it'll glow blue. When the Americans are around, that sword glows blue. So here he was given this, and it's at the Canadian War Museum. And if you ever get out to Ottawa, check out that exhibit. And this, I'm going to mention this anyway, even though this is being recorded. What used to really irked me before was I showed that sword at the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation Museum in 2002, and then the curator at the time, he wrote a letter saying we want to repatriate it. He wrote a letter to the Canadian War Museum, and then the War Museum opened up and they have this place called the Hall of Honor, and they had that portrait of Mochmanish with that sword, and then they had the sword there, and then on their display note at that time, this was like 2003, they said, legend has it that this sword belonged to Mochmanish. And I was like, that's not a legend, that's a fact. And now, because we said we want it back, you're muddying the waters, saying that it's a legend. And anyway, they say, no, we didn't say it for that reason, but in my mind, now, thankfully, when it's in the Canadian War Museum, they don't say legend. It's not a legend. They say this sword belonged to Mochmanish, and it has all this. So if you're interested in reading further about these guys, I've written, if you go onto a website called ojibweculture.ca, and then when you go on that ojibweculture.ca, there'll be a tagline, and it'll say services, and then if you scroll over that services, a drop-down menu will come, and it'll say newsletters. And then if you go to July 2012, all these guys that I'm talking about, I wrote a newsletter that features them. But in August of 2011, I wrote especially about Mochmanish because that was the 175th anniversary of the treaty that he signed. So back to this is Chief Shawanagijik from Whitefish Lake, and his son recalls this after they had a dispute with the treaty, 1850 treaty, and the boundaries of the reserve. So Shawanagijik is giving his testimony, and he says, Chief Mongoan, my father was Chief Shawanagijik. He and his braves fought against the Long Knives in that war. My father remained away the whole time of the war, fighting until they made peace. He and his warriors never received anything for their fidelity to the crown. So he's saying, and now this is how you're still treating us, even though we fought alongside you. Again, that was painted by Paul Kane. Same here, painted by Paul Kane. But here on Nipissing, I look at the records, and they would say who's coming to Manitoulin for their presents, who is getting what, and who was a deserving chief. Sometimes they listed the names, and other times they just put Lake Nipissing, one deserving warrior and one deserving wife, with no names. Then later they said French River, Shawanaga, 2 deserving chiefs and 2 deserving wives. And then they have Waigimake and Migaze. And Migaze, his name became Dokis, and now there's a whole reserve called Dokis Reserve, but Migaze was the one who fought during the War of 1812. And this fella is Chief Jigua Little Pine. But this is a picture that was taken in 1849 or 1848 when he went to Montreal, because he was actually fighting to have a treaty. What was happening was people were coming up, prospectors were coming up to the north shore of Lake Huron, and they started prospecting for copper mines. There's a place called Bruce Mines, and they have this sign that proudly exclaims, "First mine in Ontario." And one day what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a spray paint and put "First illegal mine in Ontario." So anyway, he ended up having to take a stand, and then he ended up going to jail for this. He took over another place called Micah Bay, and there's an article written by Douglas Layton, I believe, called the Michael Bay Affair. And they end up taking that over. They take one of the cannons from the Sault Ste. Marie, and they go running up there and they take over that mine. They say, you guys are taking stuff from our land, and this is our land, and you're taking minerals out of the earth, and this is actually left for us, and we need this as all the game is becoming scarce. So there's his great-granddaughter is still alive, and she remembers when she was a child that when she was in her grandmother's house, she was raised by her grandmother, that they would have this chest there, and they'd open this chest every once in a while. And just like how you see at Canadian War Museum, and I saw it at the Ontario Archives once, General Brock's red coat and the bullet hole there. Anyway, what these pine people had at that time when she was a young girl, they had his shirt. And this, what we say is he had been blessed by the Thunderbirds, and that he would never be killed. And they would pull this shirt out every once in a while, and it was just riddled with bullet holes from the War of 1812. But unfortunately what happened is that house burnt down, and that chest was in there, and it had burnt as well. But what we have are these medals, and these medals actually ended up being reminders of treaties. And I didn't show you that first 24 Nations belt. There's a medal that I believe was issued at that same time to each representative of those 24 nations. Because on the bottom of that medal it says 1764, and it has a man sitting there, and an Englishman and an Anishnaabe sitting under a tree, and it's about all these promises. So that medal would have been handed down to each chief representative of there. This is actually Jigua Conce's grandson, and he's got the War of 1812, 1813 medal, and he's actually got that Fort Detroit medal. The family still has this. Although they lost that shirt in the fire, they were able to keep the medals and the ribbons that came with that, and also a different war club. And here, this guy was a chief of Chiging, where I'm from, Chiging First Nation, and his name was David Miigwans, and he fought in World War I. And you see he's got his World War I medals, but also with his medals of his ancestor who fought during the War of 1812. He's got the Miigwans, his great-grandfather's war medal from the War of 1812. So that's why he's got this profile portrait picture. He went to Ottawa, and there was a delegation that went to Ottawa, guys from Doki's, Serpent River, Sagamuk, and Nipissing, and Chiging. And all of them, if they were war veterans, they wore their medals, and if they had their ancestors' medal, they wore that as well. And if you Google on like Tommy Prince, you see an earlier picture of Tommy Prince, and he's a young man, and he's wearing his uniform, and he's got all these medals, but he'll also have that big War of 1812 medal. And you also look up Francis Pegamagabo, same thing. He'll have a picture with all his medals, but then he'll have that big War of 1812 medal as well. So these medals, because they were round, they actually represented that these are endless and timeless promises that the British had made, and that it's got the king's visage on there. It says the king who made these promises, and that it was re-solidified during the War of 1812. So that's the website that you go to, ojibweculture.ca, and that's our facility. I no longer work there, but I took a different position, but I was there for 5-6 years and worked on different stuff, initiatives, and art. It's an art gallery, as well as a museum, and as well as other different things. But we have a lot of different things going on there. So I went overtime, but not by much, because we had a big introduction of me. So miigwech give is in the Mekin Chiek, give Jayek, Mampi, Native Canadian Center, Optrago, Nishin, Optrago, miigwech and Dash. So myself, I'm really happy that you all come out, took the time, and that you took the time to listen to part of our story. Of course, there's more of this, and I just finished talking at U of T this afternoon for 2 hours on this, and it was a different presentation, but anyway, my wife is sick of me gabbing about this 2 hours straight. Miigwech.